what's up? This is Mr. Ippolito. And if you're doing this in order, you already would have learned about the North, right? So essentially where we are is let me show you this first. We are on 5.5 and 5.6. I'm doing both of these together. And the reason why I'm doing both of these together is because we're learning about simultaneously the North and the South and how they compare to each other. Because again, the whole goal of this unit is how did we become so divided? How did the people of the North and the South become so far apart from each other that they were driven to fight and kill each other when we get to the Civil War? So you've already learned about the North. If you haven't yet, hold on, go back and watch the video on the North. And then right now we're going to go ahead and jump into the South. And so you'll be able to respond to all of these right here. Again, you're responding with what's the information, and then so what? What does this mean in terms of the South? So let's go ahead and jump in. Here we go. All right, so very similar to the structure of our talk on the North, we're going to go through each of those categories one at a time, and let's go ahead and jump into that first category, which, of course, is geography. So if you recall when we were learning about the North, it was rocky soil and small family farms. Well, in the South, there is very fertile soil, right? Fertile means crops can grow easily in this land. It has better nutrients. There are fewer rocks and stones in the soil. It's just much better suited to farming. If you've been into different parts of the state of California, if you travel along Highway 126 going from Santa Clarita out to Ventura, and you see all the orange groves and all of that farming that happens, the plants and trees and orange trees specifically. And then you get out to Ventura and Oxnard, and they grow strawberries out there. That is really fertile soil. That is soil that is good for growing crops. If you drive up between Interstate 5 and Highway 99, and you see the almond trees or the peach trees, nectarine trees, there's all sorts of different agriculture happening. They grow garlic and onions and all sorts of things in the Central Valley, right? The San Joaquin Valley in the middle of our state. Very fertile soil. Same thing in the geography of the South. Mild winters, which means better for growing crops, and so large plantations. So what does this all mean, right? Again, let's take a look. So you just finished everything that we were just talking about, you would have put it here. And if you haven't, you can go back and rewatch and put that in here. And so now what does this all mean? Well, what this means is the geography is going to affect how people live, how people interact, how people work, and it's going to impact the economy as well, right? These large plantations means that people are going to live farther apart from each other. They're not going to, you remember we talked about the North, they lived closer together in villages and cities and communities. They're going to be a little bit more tight-knit. They're also, kind of interacting more with each other up in the North. Down in the South, it's not happening so much. It's these large plantations. Your neighbors are really nowhere close to you. People are going to kind of grow. It's very spread out, very, very spread out. There was more land in the states of the South, the slave-owning states of the South, than there was in the North, right? So a lot more spread out, and really kind of based, their economy is therefore going to be very much based on this agriculture, these crops that we're talking about. All right, so let's move on. This is the question that I was throwing out at you. How do you think this is going to impact the economy and the culture of the South? That's exactly how. It's going to be much more of an agricultural-based economy, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. In terms of population, even though the land was more spread out, there was more land area in the South, the population itself was smaller than the North, right? The North, they're concentrating in the cities, millions and millions more people in the North than the South. The majority of people living in the South were small farmers or poor whites who worked on farms and plantations. 16% of whites actually owned enslaved people. So the majority of white people in the South did not own any enslaved people at all. And 32% of the Southern population, so approximately 1/3 of the humans living in the South were owned by other humans, right? So we're gonna look at that graphically in just a little bit, but this is something interesting to note, right? As we're approaching the Civil War, how do you think a smaller population of whites, right? So not only was the population in the South smaller, but you take out that third of the population that was African American, mostly enslaved African American. How is that going to impact their chances if they're going into a war and they have a smaller population? How is that going to impact them? Be thinking of that as we move into our next thing, which is the economy. So there's this thing called capitalism that is like at the basis of the American economy. Capitalism is basically this idea that you have a business and you make money. And then whatever money you make, your profits that you make, you got to figure out what to do. Like, are you going to go buy a new car, or, buy a new PlayStation or Xbox, or are you going to take that money, those profits, and are you going to reinvest that money into building capital for your business, right? Maybe you're going to have a bigger building, a bigger factory, or maybe you're going to have a bigger break room for your employees, or maybe you're going to invest in training for your employees to help make your employees better trained, or maybe you're going to give them more time off, or maybe you're going to invest it in new machinery, right? In new factory machinery. Whatever you're going to do, you have a choice as a business owner. Am I going to invest in my business? Or am I just going to kind of spend this money on whatever? And if you're going to invest in your business, how are you going to grow your business? The wealthy Southern landowners who kind of controlled most of the politics and the economy of the South, they decided that when they got these profits, right, this capital that they were going to reinvest, they decided to reinvest in two things. They were going to buy more land, and they were going to buy more humans. And that was what they invested in. What they did not invest in, and this is what I want you to think about as well, what they could have invested in and didn't, they did not invest in necessarily buying new equipment. They did not invest in maybe raising taxes a little bit so that they could build better roads or build better railroads, or try to build maybe some more harbors into their port cities. They were not necessarily investing in infrastructure. They were not necessarily investing in machinery or factories or manufacturing. And so that's going to become important as we get closer to the Civil War. They kept reinvesting their money. Let's buy more land. Let's buy more humans, more enslaved humans, right? So there, when I say their capital, we talked about capitalism. They kept reinvesting their capital into agriculture, into either people, enslaved humans to work that land, or more land itself. What did they produce? They produced cotton, they produced tobacco, rice, sugarcane, livestock, which just means they raise animals, right? And lumber. Lumber that's wood for building homes and other things. They were largely dependent on the North for manufacturing, which means they were not building factories themselves. They were not building textile mills, right? They had the cotton. There's a picture of a cotton plant right there. They had the cotton, but they had no way to do anything with the cotton. And so they basically had to take the cotton plant, and then they would use the cotton gin. I'll talk about that in a moment. They would use the cotton gin to separate the seeds from the cotton fibers, and then they would take those fibers. They had to put it on a ship and either send it up the Mississippi River or send it out, along the Atlantic Ocean and send it to these textile mills in the North, where the North was then going to take those raw materials and turn it into yarn, turn it into cloth, turn it into something that can be sold and something that can be used, right? Either ship sails or clothing, or canvas for shoes, or whatever the case may be. So they were very, very much dependent on the North for the machinery to do something with their crops, right? This is sugarcane right here, but they couldn't do anything with the sugarcane, right? So they had to sell the sugarcane. They're either selling it to the North, or maybe they're selling it to Europe, where they're going to turn it into actual granulated sugar, or it's going to be turned into molasses, which can be used for sweetening, for baking, or maybe it's going to be turned into rum. We know what rum is used for. But again, they just were creating the raw materials. They were growing the raw materials out of the ground, but they couldn't do anything with the raw materials. So if you think about the so what, again, looking right here, right? Two main investments. This is all stuff we talked about. What does this mean? What this means is they become dependent upon the North for their finished manufactured goods. And again, they're one piece of technology, the cotton gin. Ironically, you're going to read that in the textbook. Ironically, they're one big piece of tech, like the one thing that they use most often on these cotton plantations was the cotton gin, which was invented by Eli Whitney, who was a Northerner. So they're one big piece of technology, not even created or invented in the South, right? Made by a Northerner. All right, so let's get back into it. Now we're moving on to speaking of technology, very, very limited technology. I told you the cotton gin, we already said, invented by Eli Whitney. They did have some small mills, like cotton mills, textile mills, and factories, little bit. But again, for the most part, it is all all their raw materials they're having to send up north, right? So very, very limited technology. This, by the way, I wanted to show you an example of, this is a cotton gin. So this is like in a museum, right? So the biggest thing, and you'll learn about this later on too, the thing that made cotton production so labor intensive early on, and this is why cotton really wasn't profitable for a long time in the 1700s, is it was very time intensive, labor intensive, because the cotton fibers were a little sticky. They had a little bit of kind of natural, almost like a glue or like an adhesive, little stickiness to them. So it would take a while to actually pick their seeds inside the cotton plant, and you'd have to pick by hand. You'd have to pick those cotton seeds out. It was just very, very time intensive. Well, once Eli Whitney from New York invents this cotton gin, you just drop the cotton lint, that's what it's called, the cotton lint in there, right, the plant, and then you crank it, and then this machine, which has these like teeth, and it would automatically separate, and you kind of see that right here. I think it's better to see it here. It automatically separates out the seeds from the fibers, and it makes cotton production so much faster and so much more efficient and so much easier and so much cheaper. Because what you used to have to do in the South was they would take enslaved labor and by hand would be picking the seeds out. Well, now they can grow, oh my goodness, they could produce like 100 times the amount of cotton with the same number of enslaved workers. And so what you did was, if you were a plantation owner, you would have one or two of your enslaved workers cranking the cotton gin, and you have your other, 100 that would be out in the fields picking cotton. So cotton production just skyrocketed by leaps and bounds after the invention of the cotton gin. Okay, in terms of transportation, again, like I mentioned previously, the South was not willing to invest in infrastructure, few railroads, right? And you already saw, if you watched the North video, you saw the video that I showed you on, the railroads, North versus South. Far fewer railroads, few connecting waterways. They were not investing in canals. They were not building that infrastructure like they were up in the North. Only a few major ports. The two biggest port cities in the South, Charleston, South Carolina, and New Orleans, Louisiana. So again, they're limited in their transportation ability. So they're, again, relying on the North and relying on the North ships and shipping infrastructure to transport their stuff, and poor roads. Again, they're not, when we talk about investment of capital in the system of capitalism, they were making their primary investments into more land and more enslaved workers. Okay, so from what we've learned so far, assuming that you already learned about the North, what are some of those differences? And I want you can see this is originally a pair deck, but now I'm kind of turning this into, just you and me learning about this. What are some of those differences, right? We learned about transportation differences. We learned about, factories in the North versus this agricultural system in the South. And hopefully by now you've been kind of tracking some of these differences, right? Okay, so last thing we're going to talk about is culture. This is the final thing on your graphic organizer. What was the culture of the South like? Well, the culture of the South was a very genteel society with a rigid social structure. So genteel, that word genteel means it's based on we're gonna treat everybody with a certain code, right? There is a code of honor, there is a code of behavior, there is a way that we act in the South. A rigid social structure. I'm going to show you actually like a pyramid of what that social structure looked like. But it was kind of all based on honor and structure and knowing your place in society. Education is for the elite. Again, there's certainly no education for African Americans in the South. Really no education for poor whites either, right? There's no such thing as public education at this time in the South. The education is private school only, or private education only, private tutors only, and it is only for the wealthiest children. A strict class system. I'm going to show you about slavery and slave codes, which, by the way, we're going to learn about slave codes in a future lesson, so don't worry about that right now. Were very widespread communities, like I talked about. They were very spread out, kind of all, you weren't close to your neighbors for the most part. You didn't live in you take a look in some parts of Valencia where homes are like right next to each other. If you live in an apartment complex or a condo complex, or, even some bigger homes, you still, like, you're in a neighborhood, your neighbors are right next to each other. Not so in the South. In the South, your next neighbor might be, 5 to 7 minute walk down that road, right? Before you run into another household, another family, another, anybody else besides your own family. and primarily just one religion, mostly Protestant. We've learned about the difference between Catholic and Protestant Christians already, and most of those Protestants are going to be Anglicans and Baptists. And so really what you have culture-wise, we're going to teach this word here, is a homogeneous population. Homogeneous means really just one type of, kind of cultural system, really one main sort of religious system. There's not a lot of diversity, right? It's very literally, it's black and white in the South. You don't have this influx of immigration, right, from European countries. It is pretty, like I said, very homogeneous, just kind of culturally. These whites who are mostly English, Scotch, Irish, the earlier immigrants from the 16 and 1700s. That culture, that sort of ethnic background for the whites, and then these, formerly from the enslaved people coming over from Africa, anywhere from 100 to 200 years ago. The slave trade, the international slave trade, has ended now. Was ended after 1808, and so now in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. It's the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren. It's multiple generations of enslaved people. It is intergenerational slavery now within the South. Okay, so I promised you this pyramid, and so now I'm going to show it to you. At the top, who is at the top of the Southern class pyramid? I always like to, this visualization, I think, is a really, really interesting way to see things. It's the planter elite. It's the wealthy. They're the ones who control the money, the power, the politics of the South, right? The planter elite, about 8% of the population is going to be those wealthiest people. Another 8% small farmers. When I say small farmers, I don't mean like small of stature, small, they weren't small people. They just owned small farms. So this planter elite, they own the big plantations. This other 8% of these small farmers, they own their own land, but they just own a much smaller amount of land. The planter elite, they're going to own a large number of enslaved workers. The small farmers may own maybe 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 enslaved workers. They, for the most part, these whites, these small farmers, are also working the land. If they do own enslaved workers, they're working the land alongside of their enslaved workers. The planter elite, they're sipping their mint juleps out on the veranda while they're enslaved workers, and they're going to have white workers working for them as well, while their workers kind of do the work on the plantation. So the planter elite, they are not doing any of the work themselves. They are living a life of comfort and ease, while the people who work for them, whether they're enslaved or free whites, are doing the work. 50%, half of the population, are going to be these poor whites, right? So they do not own land. They might rent land. They're renting from the wealthier whites. They almost certainly do not own. They don't own their own land, and they almost certainly don't own their own enslaved workers either. So that's 50% of the population right there. You do have a very small sliver here of free African Americans. That's about 2%. They are living and working mostly in cities. There were some big cities in the South. That's a safer place for them to be. They're going to have their papers in hand, because those papers are going to show that's the proof of their freedom, that they are not owned by anyone else, that they have been granted their freedom by whoever granted them their freedom. And they're going to be working mostly as carpenters, or maybe blacksmiths, or they're working in some other sort of industry where they have a trade, right? They have some sort. They're carpenters. They have some sort of trade that they do. Okay, and then finally, down at the very bottom of the Southern class pyramid, 32% of the population, it would be enslaved African Americans. So, like I said previously, 1/3 of the population of the South was owned by another human, right? So the final thing that I want to ask, and we're approaching the 20-minute mark here, so I do want to wrap things up. Final question is, so you take a look at this pyramid here, and what does it remind you from 7th grade history? Specifically, probably the, December, January, February, depending on kind of when you learned this in 7th grade. But what does this pyramid remind you of? And I'll give you a moment. What other part of world history did you learn that had like this rigid social structure with like more powerful people at the top, and then kind of the least powerful people who worked the land down at the bottom, and hopefully you're thinking and thinking and thinking, and maybe perhaps you've come up with the answer, which is, drum roll, boom. You recognize this. This is the medieval social pyramid, right? So this was in medieval Europe, where you had the king at the top, right? So this sort of top structure in the south, this would be like the planter elite, and then you had sort of the landowning whites who maybe aren't as powerful, right? Knights and vassals, those were the kind of the small landowners in the south, and then you have this middle class right here, and then down at the bottom the peasants and serfs. And so this is, again, in medieval Europe, they worked the land because it was very agricultural based. Feudal Europe, medieval Europe was very agriculturally based, just like the South. And there are a lot of historians who argue that they were intentionally in the South, in the American South, in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. They used medieval Europe as a model. They wanted to be like the lords and ladies of of medieval Europe, right? That's what they modeled it after. Okay. Well, I hope that helps you. And if you have any questions, like I said, just like I said with the North, talk to a friend, talk to a colleague, a peer in your class, or the next time you see me, talk to me, and I can help you out with that as well. All right. I hope this was helpful. Take care, and I'll see you in our next class. Bye-bye.